Everyone has that one garment they wish that they could replicate. For me, it is this little jumpsuit over here. Now, not only is it discontinued, but it doesn't quite fit me anymore. And so in today's video, I'm going to be sharing tips and tricks to trace down any one of your favorite garments so that you can make it in any fabric and any color that you so wish. And when the inevitable happens and our bodies fluctuate, you'll also be able to have a foundation pattern that you can change for years to come. Let's jump into it. As you can see, from backless details to darts and inseam pockets, not to mention that pesky crotch curve, there's a lot going on with this jumpsuit design, but I am going to be giving you 3 ways to trace off a pattern so that you can select one that suits your unique creative process and start copying your wardrobe for pieces that fit and flatter. To explore these techniques, you're going to need a few things. Now, first off is pattern cutting paper. You could also get away with newspaper or some form of tracing material. You're going to need pattern weights and or pins. These are just industrial washers, but I find them very handy to weight down my garments and my patterns. A pencil and a tape measure. You want to make sure that your tape measure has not stretched over time and that it is showing accurate measurements. You also want to make sure that your pencil, if you don't have a mechanical pencil like this one, has a very sharp nib for accuracy. I will also be using a pattern master, but this is an amalgamation of a ruler, a French curve, and a set square. So just something to be able to finalize your patterns. A tracing wheel and some paper-specific scissors. Please, for the love of God, do not use your fabric scissors. Now, the first technique admittedly works best on more basic or simple garments, and you may have seen this all across the internet, but it is simply to trace. Now, there are ways to do this. You'll notice that I have folded the edge of my paper here, and I can fold my simple garment. I will be doing this on my jumpsuit shortly. Fold my simple garment in half, and what I want to do, seam to seam, give your garment a good press before you do this. Seam to seam, I just want to establish where my center front and or my center back line is, because we will be tracing off the front and the back of the garment. Fold these together, just let it organically fall where it wants to. And this is when your pins might come in handy. If your pins don't perforate or damage your fabric, and this wouldn't work well on a silk garment, for example, but on this basic knitwear, I can just pop a pin through like that, and I can secure a pin where the two side seams meet. And I can just ever so gently smooth that out until I feel like I've established my center front line. And I can then mark just one layer of my fabric there with a pin. And the same at the top, mark one layer of fabric with a pin. I can then unpin my side seams, flatten out my top, and I can align these 2 pins to the edge of my folded paper. And so that pin aligns to this edge. And this pin, if I feel through the fabric and the paper, aligns to this edge. You can then secure that in place with weights or with more pins if you so wish, before tracing around the edge of that pattern. When it comes to this point, the armhole, just have a little look. This is an extra piece of fabric. This is actually a trim around the armhole. So I would be tracing off this line here. And I understand you're thinking, how on earth do I do that when you'll just be drawing on fabric? That is when, with caution, your tracing wheel comes into play. You can move this all around the armhole with a little bit of pressure. Again, it's very garment dependent. If you have a silk garment or something delicate, you don't want to be perforating it with the serrated edges of a tracing wheel. So this technique might not be suitable for all garments, but we're going to go into 2 more shortly. And you can push through the garment and through the fabric and trace through until you hit a seam line. Unfold onto your paper and trace off that full piece. Do not forget to add your seam allowance. Whenever you are tracing a garment, the seam allowance has already been incorporated. And so on the inside of this here, this would be your seam allowance. The beauty of tracing your own patterns is you can determine what you want your seam allowance to be. So adding 1 centimeter or 2 centimeters or 1.5 centimeters to your seam allowance is your discretion as the designer. So let's apply this technique to my jumpsuit. So if I open the back of my jumpsuit top out, we can see on the inside here we have a seam line. I've got a center back zip to the top bodice of the back of my jumpsuit, and I can smooth this out and just place a weight, and then I can smooth it as far in this direction as possible, place a weight there, and I can then very crudely literally trace around the edges of this jumpsuit up to the seam lines. When it hits this seam line here, which I appreciate might be hard to see from the right side because of the dark color, I can, with pressure, denim would be a fine fabric to use a tracing wheel on, quite resistant. With pressure, go along that seam line there, almost like when you stitch in the ditch. And I can also notch on the edges where that seam line starts and finishes before tracing around my armhole. And I'm going to just very gently try and lie this flat as I'm manipulating the pattern. It doesn't matter that this edge down here is now moving because I've traced what I need to up to that point. And I can flatten my garment and trace like so. Now, when I move my garment away, I can see the perforated edges that I've traced here. I can see the start and stop of where my center back and my shoulder seam are open. And I can bring in my pattern master or my pattern cutting ruler of choice, and I can just finish these off. Now you might get natural warping of the seams, and so it is up to us just to true that. If your seam is a little bit wobbly, that is just going to be natural through wear and tear of the garment. There's a reason why it's your favorite garment. And so I can just start to connect these, truing the shape out with my pattern master. Same with the armhole. And the edge of my pattern master, I'm going to try and match up the most natural curve that my pattern master follows. And with my center back line, I'm going to use that as my grain line, and I can plot my grain line in like so. And I can now determine how much seam allowance I want to add. So maybe I want to add 1 centimeter. Another thing you'll have noticed from the inside of this pattern is the facing. Now, facing is a way of neatening a curved edge. It's easy to neaten a straight edge by simply folding up the fabric. That would be called self-faced. But along curved edges, such as your armhole here and your neckline here, notice that these have a seam line on each piece. So I can take an educated guess that we have cut facing pieces that simply, if I was to follow it on my pattern, I can measure that. Looks to be about 2.5 centimeters wide. I can follow that shape around, and this shape here, this little strip here, would also become a facing pattern. And so I would repeat that around my armhole and around the curve of the back here. So label it, center back, jumpsuit pattern, whatever you want to name it. I would date it, cut 1 pair in self. Just understand how to label your patterns. This is the grain line. Let's move on to the next technique. The second method is to simply take and translate measurements. Now I have my back pattern piece here. What I can do, and what I encourage doing just as a good habit, is taking your seam line measurements. Now notice I'm not including the seam allowance here. So that is 12 centimeters. And I will write 12, it could, whatever you're measuring in, inches, centimeters, I will write that along every seam line. It just speeds up the process. And if I measure the center back seam there, that is 24. And so I would write 24. And the shoulder seam here, that is 5.5. Now, knowing that this is 12 centimeters, what I can do, bringing in my pattern piece, I need to measure this panel here just to complete the back bodice. Knowing that I've traced off, this is 12 centimeters, but I can just bring in my tape measure and cross-reference that. Bearing in mind this is without seam allowance, that's 12. This seam here is 11, so it's 1 centimeter shorter. And if I measure across the center of this panel, that is 6.5 centimeters wide. So let's start by drafting 12 centimeters. So that is 6 centimeters plus 6 centimeters. I'm also going to mark the middle of this 12 centimeter line. I can then measure my 6.5 centimeters for the width of this panel. And I can now measure the distance of the bottom, this panel here, which is 7.5 centimeters. And on the top here, this is a slight curve. So what I can now do is connect these lines. This should be 7.5. And I now know that through that center point, which is 6.5 centimeters, I need 11 centimeters. And I can connect these two with a soft curve. So I know that this full length here was 12 centimeters. And so what I was able to do is mark the halfway point, 7.5, understand the angle, and with my pattern master connecting the line here to here, I have that soft curve. Now what I could do is place that over and check how that looks. And to me, that looks like a very similar shape. And so I can just add my seam allowance to this, making sure that my seams align and making sure that this trues. This looks like a continuation of that curve, and this looks like a continuation of that curve. So we're just wanting to make sure the shape that we are tracing follows one another. And so taking measurements and translating those is another way to trace off your pattern and to copy down your pattern. Let's do it with the front bodice now, something a little bit more complex. And I can show you how this is easy to apply. I'm just going to add my seam allowance. If I bring in my piece like this, you can either mask and tape that together, or with a pin, you can secure that together. And from my center back line with my pattern master, I can just carry that over in order to put on my grain line for this pattern piece. And always try and add your grain line through the longest length of your pattern. It's going to really help you align that when you come to cut out in fabric. And so I've just carried my grain line over from my back pattern piece to my back side. And again, just label your pattern piece like so. To trace off the bodice, we're going to combine both techniques. We're going to measure and trace around the shape. So the first thing I want to do is establish my center front line, doing the same fold technique as before. I can then bring in my tape measure and take the measurement of half of this front and 11.5 that side. Therefore, I can take an educated guess to square off a base of 11.5. And if I take the top of my neckline, the length down to the waistline there, making sure that this is as flat as possible, we're going to go across 11.5 and square across, marking 11.5, and we're going to square up by 27. Squaring up, squaring across, squaring off, you're going to hear me use that interchangeably. It basically just means drawing a line at a 90-degree angle. And so at this stage, you may wish to trace around it. So folding my garment in half, I might wish to just lay this along my center front line. You can use a weight or two to keep this in place. Flatten out your shoulder seam and you can trace around the top like so, moving that away, and you can still use your measurements just to cross-reference that that's correct. So I know that my shoulder seam width is 5.5. And I can just true out that neckline shape with my pattern master. When it comes to tracing the dart, we've got a dart going on here. So if we actually look to the interior of this garment, we can see not only the length of the dart is 9 centimeters, and the width of the dart at the widest point is 1.5. Now from the right side, this is where denim has worked in my favor. You can see a very faint line and ridge by there, which is also going to indicate the width of the dart. But turn your garment inside out and you're going to be able to see whatever this width is. And for me, that is 1.5 centimeters. You want to double it because the fabric is folding this way. If I flip that over, it's also folding the other way. So for me, I need a dart that is 3 centimeters wide and 9 centimeters in length. So with my garment folded in half, I want to align my center front to the center front line. And you can either align that there through pins or through weights. For this purpose, I'm going to pin it to my paper. So implementing the tracing technique, and with this pin to my center front so that it doesn't budge, I can mark and trace to the end of my seam allowance. And with a pin, or I will use a tool called an awl here, I can pivot that in place and mark the end of the dart point, which if we took the measurement, we know is 9 centimeters. I can then unpin my pattern from the center front on the waistline. If I flip that back, I can measure a line that's 4.5 centimeters because I've taken that measurement. And I know my dart width is 3 centimeters, so I can plot that by there. So I have a 3 centimeter gap. I can now pivot my pattern up to that 3 centimeter opening, and I can come in and trace around my armhole. If I unpin that, what this has given me is my armhole shape, my dart opening, which is 3 centimeters here, and if I mark the 1.5 point, and where I put that all, or I marked into my pattern, I know that's where my bust point is. And so again, if I line that up, I can cross-reference the measurement of the length of that dart, draft it in to my bust point. Now I know that that side seam from my measurements is 11 centimeters. So here is 4.5. I therefore want this end of my side seam to be 6.5, and I can then true out my armhole shape. And so tracing off my front bodice has combined both sets of skills. What you can then do is fold your dart, put the excess towards the bottom, and with a tracing wheel you can true that off. If I open that out, that has changed the dart shape ever so slightly. This is cut on fold, so I don't need to add any seam allowance there. And you can just carry on as you did before with your facing patterns as well, adding your seam allowance in. We have our dart in place, we've traced that off, accounted for the width, pivoted this. This is a form of dart manipulation which we cover inside the DPL Atelier. You just want to extend your dart legs for them to be a notch on your pattern. If I fold this down as though we were constructing that dart, and I align my pattern piece to this, pivoting it around, what you can then do is just notch where that dart is closed, and this will help you with a balance point when you come to reconstruct. If I walk that pattern, and walking the pattern is just a case of pivoting it along the seam line, just to check the lengths, just to make sure that all your patterns are balanced and the same length, then this is now going to act as a notch to help us balance the two pieces together. Now, the final technique I want to show you is arguably the easiest, but it is used for the most complex areas of a garment. And that is to equip yourself with some old plastic packaging. I do tend to keep any plastic packaging that comes through the door for this purpose. You can achieve this with food wrap or cling film. However, due to it being much, much thinner, I do find packaging plastic has a little bit more sturdiness to it and is better suited for this technique. And what you want to do is you want to lay the area. If we take this sleeve pattern from my partner's shirt, you just want to lay the part of the garment into the plastic, and we can basically wrap it up. We need the flexibility of the plastic for this to work. And I'm going to come in and pin that in place. Now, be careful. This will blunt your pins over time, but you should be replenishing your pins regardless. They're much like your needles with projects. And I'm just going to come in and straighten this out as much as I can. You don't need to, but I'm just going to line up what was the fastening of this bag to the seam of the sleeve. And I'm just going to pin that in place like so. The plastic is flexible. It allows it to be malleable around a 3-dimensional shape. And I can then fold this over. If I need to Frankenstein that together, I can. This obviously isn't going to be your final pattern piece. This is just a hack to allow you to trace more complex shapes. Before equipping yourself with a marker, I'm going to slide a bit of paper under my work just to protect my surface. And the intention I'm doing here is to copy the armhole shape of this garment. And so what I can do along that seam line is follow that around, and I can very gently flip my work, or tracing around that shape as well, marking my shoulder notch where my shoulder seam is. Momentarily, we know that was acting as the seam line, and straighten any bits out. And then with caution, taking care, you can remove your pins one by one before removing your garment. And you now have the shape of your sleeve to trace off. We know that this is the side seam, the underarm seam. You now have the shape of your sleeve head to trace off and translate into a pattern. And so there we have it, 3 tips to trace your favorite garments. Of course, the 4th tip, a little bonus tip, is to deconstruct the garment completely. Now, just like this one here, this old jacket of mine, the leather went pretty disgusting. And so I've unpicked it into pattern pieces. Just bear in mind that if you are tracing garments that you have worn over the years, there can be a tendency to stretch or warp ever so slightly. So always try to cross-reference to your measurements. And if you're wondering how to do that, then why not sign up for my free Pattern Cutting Basics course, which I've linked down below. I would love to know in the comments if you've ever tried to trace off your favorite garment and how that worked out for you. Did you face any hurdles, or have you got a Mickey Mouse wardrobe with a beautiful piece and style on repeat? I can't wait to hear from you, but for now, stay safe, keep creative, and I will catch you on the flip side.